Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Tiki Bar. Today, I am delighted to be joined by Everett Berry. He leads go-to-market engineering at Clay. He is in, I believe, Brooklyn, New York. Everett, how is spring in New York?
Spring is beautiful in New York. I have a young daughter. I've just been taking her out to learn to walk. So spring is sprung in New York, and it's great.
How old is your daughter? That's good vibes.
She's 16 months. She is. You might say she should be walking right fully by now, but she's on her way.
No, things happen at different times. I've got a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, and one on the way. And the 2-year-old was way slower to walk, but like fast in language. That's how it goes.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that's
The skill development tree with her has been super interesting. I've seen the same thing. Some skills really fast, other skills they take a while and then snap. It's there. But it's been an absolute delight. I'm excited for your third as well. I also have had a great time and hope to have more.
love to hear that. Love to hear that. Now let's go back to when Everett was a little guy growing up, I believe in Indiana. What did you want to be when you were a kid?
I wanted to be an architect. I loved buildings, construction. Still love to walk around New York City and look at all the buildings. And a lot of my drawings as a kid are like various construction things. I loved Caterpillar. I loved
Nice.
Indiana's a haven for like construction equipment and so forth and manufacturing. So I was obsessed with that stuff growing up.
Absolutely. I love that. So what ended up being your first paying job?
So let's think here. I guess I would have had a lawn business, but really what I did is I worked in the sort of cart barn at a golf course. So I grew up right next to Purdue University in a college town attached to Purdue, and ultimately went there as well. But I worked at the Purdue golf course, in the cart barn for many years, actually, just kind of like cleaning all the carts and. Of course, got to play a bunch of free golf as well, which was fantastic.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. My buddies had that job. For some reason, I couldn't get it at the course. I think they were kind of protective about the free golf that came with it because that was like a premium.
I think we paid for lessons with the pro, and then during that asked about the job opening. So I think we did a little bit of our own sort of prospecting for that.
I like that. Now, I read that you're a fifth generation Purdue engineer, and I've been to West Lafayette. I know the history of Purdue engineering. Did you already know what type of engineer you wanted to be when you went there?
No, I actually was very non. I didn't do a lot of planning for things, and in high school. In fact, Purdue was the only college I applied to as well, so I was not sort of super up to date on sort of college admissions process and all of that. And but when I got to Purdue, I really got into computers and software, and so ultimately became a computer engineer. And probably looking back, like might have considered computer science, but I'm actually super glad I did computer engineering because they teach you more of the low level
Mm.
aspects of like how computers work, and actually working in tech that served me super well in terms of being able to more deeply understand some of the systems issues, quite frankly, that come with all the software that we use.
Yeah, a bit more practical. That makes sense. And I was reading about this. It seemed like you were really involved in this thing called the Cam 2 project, which I was checking out. And
Mhm.
when I was reading about it, it seemed pretty like futuristic. You're kind of talking about like a big network of cameras and real-time video analysis. And this is like, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago. Can you just explain kind of what that project was and what it meant for you?
Yeah, I had this fantastic professor at Purdue, Dr. Yun-Sun Liu. He was unique in that he believed in undergraduate research, which is not true of like most professors. And so as a sophomore, I got to start building web apps for his research group. Nothing too groundbreaking there, but over time got into more of the deeper things that they were doing, including large scale image analysis. And that was when I got my first exposure to neural networks. And then that actually, the work there turned into this company that I started directly from that work. And so it was a really a pivotal time for me. And I was very interested in the subject matter too. I always felt that the digital world was super mapped out. It was super, you could go on Google Maps and kind of like go anywhere and look at things. But in the real world, you really could not actually get sort of like real time views of a line in a coffee shop or
Yeah.
various things. And so actually that whole space has not really taken off the way that I thought it would. I thought at this point there would be a much crazier stuff happening, but I have a feeling that in the span of time, all the cameras that are set up all around the cities and all of the self-driving cars and everything will eventually be like networked together into these super interesting systems. And so we did some very early work on things like that. One of the projects that we did was we created an alternate view of the Macy's Thanksgiving Parade from the New York City street cameras, which was a terrible view because it was from like these high up street cameras, but it was nonetheless, we were able to follow the parade through the different views. And so had a lot of fun working on those projects. And it was some of the best, most creative days of my life, I have to say, doing the development.
That's awesome. Yeah, I love your career arc because there's this technical aspect, there's a founder aspect, and you eventually get into growth, which we'll talk about. Can you tell the founding story of Perceive?
Yes, well, we wrote these grants to the government. So there's these National Science Foundation SBIR grants, and we wrote them. Eventually, we were awarded about $1.5 million from these grants to
Awesome.
start this company that's doing large scale image analysis. We decided to focus on retail stores, which in hindsight was a terrible idea. We knew almost nothing about go to market, but we were funded by these grants. We hired engineers, and we were doing commercial development, and I was the co-founder and CTO of that company. And then eventually became CEO of that company as well, and moved to San Francisco to raise money for it and all of that. But at the beginning, we funded it with National Science Foundation grants, and we built a lot of cool, but ultimately not commercially successful technology.
Well, you're like 22 years old at the time or something like that. And you're stepping into leadership roles, right? Like you're managing teams of engineers or something along those lines. What is that like for you at such a young age?
Well, actually, I don't think I did a great job. One of my engineers gave me a reference call, did a reference call for me for a future job, and one of the things that he told the hiring manager at that job was that I was not the best manager. I think over time I've actually improved quite a bit and all of that, but no, I don't. I think like I had some instinct for kind of what made sense in terms of leading people, but in terms of operationally managing a team, I was super green, and learned a lot. I learned actually quite a bit from that experience in terms of what was ultimately most helpful for people as you were kind of managing them or trying to get everybody to move in the same direction.
Yeah, it's kind of a leading question because at such a young age, when you have so much going on with a new company, like I would imagine it's very hard to be skilled at that. Like I remember my first leadership role, which came later in life, and it's still, there was just tons of surprises.
Yeah, I think, Clay has some of the best leadership folks that I've ever worked with in terms of a deep understanding of organization and how to efficiently get things done and grow, of course, and sort of inspire people. I really I really knew almost nothing about that at the time. There's one thing from those days that I think has stuck with me, which is like very hands-on sort of frontline type stuff. Even at Clay today, I still work deals, and in previous roles, I still wrote the copy when I was in marketing roles and all that. And it wasn't. I don't think it comes from a place of being a micromanager or anything like that. But I think there is something to leadership where if you don't at least occasionally feel what it's like on the front line, you start to lose a little bit of touch and instinct for what you should do and decisions you should make. And I do think I've always done that well in my career, but the theory of management and how to organize people and projects, I probably had a rough start on that. But I think those lessons were deeply learned. They were deeply felt, and so in many ways it was a beneficial thing for me.
So you're in this product building, leadership kind of focused part of your career, and then you eventually move into some growth roles. How did that transition go? Were there any surprises along the way?
Yeah, lots of surprises. So what happened was I'd moved to San Francisco to raise money for Perceive, my first company, and I'd met this fantastic network of people. And when you think of San Francisco, I really do think network is probably one of the main things to think about because the folks that I met there, I'm still super good friends with. And as Perceive was essentially in its death throes, I got acquainted with the founder of this company called Archetype, who just needed operational help. And I'd learned a lot of the operational side of very early stage businesses by running Perceive myself and by learning that way. So I just kind of signed on with him as a consultant, again, in kind of the final days of Perceive, to help him basically close their seed round. And so the very first thing I did was I just like assembled all of the safes. And I sort of set up the initial employee systems, payroll, taxes, like a lot of the operational side that is, it's almost like a chief of staff type role or something like that at the very early stage, which handles the operational aspects of like what a founder is out there doing. Because if you're the founder, ideally you're doing mostly very high leverage tasks instead of, for example, collecting safes and things like that. And so we'd hired this really fantastic growth person at that company who did our initial set of growth. Archetype was a SQL client, a client for developers to write queries in. It was kind of like a postman, but for SQL. And then what happened was our growth person quit somewhat suddenly, and then we didn't hear from him for a while. And it turned out he was a contestant on the reality show Big Brother, and so they took his phone, and so I was trying to kind of text him to roll over his 401k and stuff. So I didn't hear from him for months, and he became a contestant on the reality show Big Brother, and then he met this girl there. They started dating, and then the two of them eventually won the Amazing Race later. And so he went from kind of being a growth person in tech to and now he's on Instagram, and he's super popular and everything, and he's a fantastic guy too. So I'm super thrilled for him. But that whole saga allowed me to step into the growth role because it was essentially just me and the CEO now on the go-to-market side. And I was like, look, I'd love to take a shot at this. I think I understand the types of people we're trying to reach out to, what kind of content would be interesting. We had a very content-focused growth strategy at the time. This was also 2021 when developer tools were very hot, and so it was really a great opportunity, quite frankly. And so I then did the growth IC role, then hired some people and led growth at Archetype, and we grew the company pretty well in terms of user base. And then eventually the company was acquired by ClickHouse. And a lot of the Architect team is actually still at ClickHouse building out their kind of SQL UI for ClickHouse Cloud. And around the time that Architect was acquired by ClickHouse, I got to know the co-founders of this other company, Vantage, which I was initially kind of bugging them to do some co-marketing together because they had this amazing site called ec2instances.info. And it's this site where you can, for example, Google EC2 pricing, and you'll hit this website. And so they get a lot of traffic from it, which is really an amazing resource. It's very well known in the AWS community. And because Archetype was a SQL client, there was a part of the site that was focused on databases. And so the idea was, well, let's co-market Archetype together on this database side. But as I got to talking to those co-founders, I actually started to realize, and they began to kind of pitch me on how amazing their business was. It was kind of a cost optimization business for AWS, and they had some amazing customer wins. They closed PBS super early. Their revenue was up and to the right. And actually, Archetype never really turned on the revenue component of that company actually before it was acquired. And so I was like, look, this is a chance to go be sort of the first growth person at a company that has, really serious co-founders, interesting logos already, a clear business model. Basically, they charge a percentage of cloud spend, and everybody knows cloud spend is $1 trillion market. So I was like, I more or less jumped at it. I was like, this is a fantastic opportunity. And then did growth there for 2 years and discovered Clay while at that company. So that's kind of my transition from engineering and founder into growth.
I know that I worked at Google Cloud during that time. There were similar companies that popped up on the cost optimization side. I mean, super beneficial. I'm curious, it sounds like no, but was there any apprehension for you as this kind of engineering technology first person to now I'm this growth oriented person? How did you think about that?
Well, it's actually been the same thread throughout my career, but I felt very comfortable as a growth person at two developer tools companies because I was a developer. And so I felt that I could probably one of the main things I brought to bear at both those companies was producing interesting content that drove clicks and so forth. But I felt I could really speak to them and understood how developers discovered tools, how they adopted them, how they thought about paying for them. And so I wasn't too nervous about it because it felt very authentic to me. And it's actually the same story with Clay. After being a Clay customer for 2 years, I felt it was almost easy to pitch it because I just really knew it. And so no, not too much apprehension, I would say.
No, I love that. That's a very practical but also pure way to think about what you're doing is kind of, does this make me feel authentic? So you go to Clay and you're leading go-to-market engineering, and there's a sales component there. I was listening to another interview that you did where you mentioned that this was maybe your first time truly running sales motions all the way through. Is that fair? And what was that transition like for you?
And that's true. That's my first sales role and also first sales leadership role. I think one note, which we're actually trying to sort out messaging wise right now, but so go-to-market engineering at Clay, it's probably better to describe us as forward deployed go-to-market engineers in that we help customers do the job of go-to-market engineering, but there are kind of real go-to-market engineers at other companies, which are not customer facing. They're generally like more like high leverage pipeline generation roles where they are kind of operating these AI systems at scale to do that. So just a quick definitional thing there. But yeah, I've had to kind of learn the sales process stuff and the sales leadership stuff. Um, Sort of from some actually amazing mentors at Clay and from others in the market. But to me, the number one thing that I always looked for in a sales interaction when I was buying software before was I just wanted a product expert to talk about the product and to actually provide advice on what I should do as a customer of the product, potential customer. And so the primary thing that I did and still do and that our team does is we help people understand what Clay is, what it's used for. We give them advice on like what we think are like interesting motions that are kind of specific to the company, interesting campaigns they can run, data points they can get, how to think about data quality, CRM, AI, and go to market, all those things. And then we very deeply help them build and test those ideas in Clay. And we do it end to end. And so it's not like there's a solutions engineer that kind of does the demo or whatever. Like our GTM engineers run the process end to end. They do the technical side and the sales side. And I think like Clay is relatively simple in terms of pricing and packaging. It's just consumption. And so the idea is kind of like if you can help customers discover the right use cases and they're happy with the data, and then you just kind of map that instead of the sample data to all the data that they want to enrich, you end up with these like reasonably sized contracts, and I could kind of take it from there. That said, I like to tell people we are like we are good at all the things that most sales teams are bad at, but we are kind of not amazing at the things that some sales teams are good at. For example, we have a whole project right now to become like better at discovery. And so I really just appreciate the Clay founders like taking this approach, because there's no way I would have a sales leadership role at any other company, I don't think. And they've given me space to kind of introduce this like different way of selling, and then given me flexibility to kind of say, okay, you've got something going here, let's start to introduce some traditional elements of like of great sales process, but we've kept it fairly light, and I'm proud of that.
I love that. There's this Clay is a creative company all the way down to the tooling, and so it makes sense that you are protecting that. I can tell. And we actually we reset all of our customer case studies to be just like yours, because I love the way that Clay thinks about its immersion in its customers and their technical problems and how that relates back to the business. So whatever you're doing is awesome. And inspirational to many. Now, I'm curious if there's a moment where you feel like it maybe did click for you, because clearly things have been going well. Go-to-market engineering is now clearly kind of all the rage. Is there a moment where you knew you're like, okay, right away, I made the right decision here?
Well, it wasn't my first quarter. We missed our target completely. I think sometime around late August, I think it was. We actually made some interesting decisions. It wasn't really clear things were actually working for a good while. And in fact, we'd been hiring people kind of slowly as a result of that. And we actually decided to pause our hiring just to give the team, which was 6 or 8 people, a chance to kind of settle in. And we decided to pause our hiring because we'd missed my first quarter. The second quarter, we were also not on track. And so this was like 4 or 5 months in. And so it wasn't really clear that like this GTM engineering thing was actually the right. But we began to have a few deals that started to look pretty positive. And the total number on those deals was like going to exceed our, kind of Q3 quotas. And so right around the time we paused hiring, you could kind of begin to see the light with the Q3 number. And I remember thinking like, yeah, pausing is like the right decision. We should sort of take stock and reevaluate here. And then like 3 weeks later, we began on this cadence, which actually hasn't abated, where we started closing these like pretty good sized contracts with pretty good logos. And it was about probably like early September when I started to kind of see my quarterly number as in sight and maybe even like exceed it. And that's when I remember thinking like, okay, I think we're gonna hit our number. And it wasn't just that, but all the people on the team were going to hit their quotas as well. So it's not like the deals were like distributed across 1 or 2 people. Yeah. And then the other thing for me is I actually hadn't closed anything for myself. I've been trying to kind of close deals and sort of stand up this team. But my first two deals also closed in September. And so it was right around then when I started to feel like, okay, this is actually like sort of the bet we've made here is actually working. And in hindsight, it worked so well that we actually shouldn't have probably paused hiring. But it was very hard to see that, like, day to day, week to week, looking at the numbers. So yeah, but it was right around like September, late August, early September of last year when, pardon me, when I believe that I began to feel that we could maybe even step on the gas on this stuff.
Absolutely. All right, I'm going to pause. My next question is slightly corny. I read that you likened selling clay to playing golf. Can I force you to make that metaphor once more?
Yeah. So, I think golf is also a creative endeavor. There's probably a few parallels. One is that golf is a creative endeavor. When you're playing golf and you're like reasonably good at it, you begin to sort of see all these shots that you didn't see before. And you begin to sort of see a hole or a course laid out, and you think, no, I don't have to hit it up the middle. I could hit it to the right, and that would give me a better angle to this green, or I could actually hit it. I could choose a different club and I could hit it shorter, and that might give me a longer second shot, but it actually provides me a wider landing area in the fairway. So actually, golf I mean, I'm not any kind of pro or anything, but I played in high school and everything, and I know a bunch of good golfers. And so as you get better at golf, sort of the world opens up, and you start to really have a lot of fun. I actually think golf is a game which, as you get better at, you have way more fun than if you're not as good. Clay is like that as well. There is a creativity to clay. There's also a skill level to clay. As you become better at clay, it also becomes way more fun, and you start to sort of see things you didn't see before. And you start to sort of see, for example, probably one of our most advanced use cases is the ABM use case that I've been talking about a little bit. It's fairly complex. It's like 10 tables. It's a fairly built out workflow. And you need, I would say, a certain skill level at clay to operate it. But the results that you can drive for this are really fantastic. I mean, we run most of our enterprise demand gen out of this pretty finite set of tables. And so as you get better at clay, you see more things, you can actually be more creative, and you can have more fun. And what is formerly thought of as being maybe like, a skill that needs to be picked up actually just becomes this like enjoyable activity. So golf is very similar to that. I think the learning curve for clay is not as steep as golf, but still learning the skill of clay, I think, is like tremendously beneficial. And I sometimes think, if I were to like leave clay or go, something, have to work somewhere else for some reason. Of course, as a sales leader, you always have that in the back of your mind in some ways. I know I'd be fine because I know clay super well, and I know that I could use it to make an impact at any other company. And that's a really fantastic feeling. It's a little bit maybe like knowing Figma super well as a designer, or, knowing another kind of like power user tool.
Yeah.
And so there's a few parallels, but I would say the ability to be creative and the sort of idea that clay is a skill does strike me as similar to golf.
I like that a lot. I experienced that. When I first started with clay, because I knew I needed to get into the weeds and just try to do something. And I kind of went in with this idea of this little workflow I could build, and I ended up doing a bunch of different stuff. And it was really fun once you kind of start opening your mind to the little mushroom trip that is your first clay table.
It's super fun. A lot of B2B software is not fun, and it's kind of like not that fun. And clay is super fun. Selling clay, in my opinion, is super fun. And working with customers on clay is super fun. We've started doing a lot more kind of in-person workshops. So there's an underappreciated element to the fact that it's enjoyable. And I think, like, you're going to use things that you enjoy, and you're going to gravitate towards those things. And I certainly felt that way as a clay customer. And so to be inside clay, also seeing other people experience that, it's a never ending source of joy for me.
Oh, that's awesome. I'm going to switch gears here for a minute. You appear to be a big fan of Dostoevsky, from your Twitter feed at least. Can you tell me when this love affair began and maybe what your favorite book is?
Well, I met this great venture fund, 1517 Ventures, when I was in San Francisco raising money for Perceive. They didn't invest, which is probably for the best, but the two partners there were really fantastic. And one of those partners started a reading group during COVID, which was focused on like basically classic literature. And Dostoevsky, for various reasons, like tech people really like Dostoevsky. His works are more psychological. They have like strong political arguments against like nihilism, for example, and there's all these like interesting themes, and a lot of it actually echoes to this day. And so I got into Dostoevsky during one of these reading groups, and In fact, I'm in another one of them right now. All these years later, we're reading Confessions by Saint Augustine. But we would read different chapters, and then we would kind of discuss. And it was this just really like extra curricular activity that was fun during COVID, which in many ways, my memories of COVID are that it was like very like screen driven, and very like tech driven. And so to have this sort of older literature to go through was great. I have to say, I'm a massive fan of Crime and Punishment, which might sound like a bit of a high school English answer, but it really is a fantastic book. And there's not a ton of books that are written from sort of the villain's point of view. And The Idiot is another great Dostoevsky book that is similar to that. But I love Crime and Punishment. And then the other thing I really love about Dostoevsky is that his writing is very tactile. So there's a lot of passages where it's like they're talking about how many rubles they're spending on things, or they're talking about the street names, and there's all this description of like, well, he went up X Street and turned down Y Street. And so the portrait that he paints of life in 1860s, etc., Russia, is just really, it feels very real to me, and it feels actually very modern in the sense that there's currency, there's letters, there's postal service, there's the concerns of the characters are like not really like war and sort of things that are present in sci-fi. Other things, they're like society issues and concerns that feel that kind of echo today. So yeah, for many reasons, I love Dostoevsky, but I have to say I love the popular works too, and Crime and Punishment.
My wife's favorite book, so she'll like that one. My reading group that started also during COVID times is one of my favorite pastimes. We still do it every other Sunday. Everybody's kind of got kids now, so it sometimes is less participants, but we still hold on to it pretty strong. So
Well, usually what I find with these reading groups is like there will be a couple people that are quite good and could carry the conversation themselves without everybody else. And so I actually like that because it teaches me a lot of things that I haven't picked up in the works. And then the people in these groups themselves are super fascinating. A lot of them are you almost like wouldn't be able to connect with them in any other form. And I just you gotta have stuff like that in life where it's kind of disconnected from the day-to-day the day-to grind, especially if you're in tech and startups, and it can become like very consuming, very all consuming.
Yes, and you're a parent. You layer that in,
Yes,
and
that's true.
it's
Yeah.
pretty easy to have the calendar fill up. So good on you for keeping that going. So I was clearly creeping on your Twitter to get that, and then I've got a couple other that I want to go through if that's okay. So you mentioned that those who know SaaS workflows will rule the world. What does that mean?
So I think like a lot of the SDR workflow is a good example of this, right? It is like a classic workflow where you pull in contacts from SalesNav. You add them to the right accounts in your CRM. Then you add them to a sequence in your sequencer, and then your sequence has been kind of pre-set up in order to send them like the right message. So that is like a workflow, a SaaS workflow. It involves 3 or 4 different tools. It's a workflow that a lot of SDRs are going to know. When you stand up an SDR org, you're going to kind of expect that people come in and they do that as their job. But the fact that workflow is so specific also means that actually a lot of it can be automated. And it strikes me that there are many, many types of workflows like this. You might consider like employee onboarding as another workflow where it touches a bunch of different tools. Or things like Riplane that or Deal that automate portions of it, but typically it still touches all these other tools. I think the promise with AI is that these workflows, the fact that they can kind of be done end to end in a repetitive manner, that means they will be automated, and the people that understand them will then be able to kind of create those automations and probably be like very high leverage people. I quite frankly think GTM engineering is one of the first of these roles where within go-to-market, you do just have all of these pretty defined workflows that touch different tools. And the GTM engineers, they understand what those are, and then they go and like automate them. And then the people that did those workflows are now able to do sort of higher level tasks. And so I think that pattern will repeat across every function of the company. And the folks and the founders that sort of lock in on what those workflows are and build the agentic versions of them or the AI versions of them will be successful. Or the people that understand them and are able to automate them for their companies will be successful.
That's really well said. So, okay, my final question. What's a book, podcasts, could be any other piece of content that you continually are recommending people to go check out. And bonus points if it's not go to market or Clay related, just something that if I'm talking to Everett, he says go check this out.
Yeah. Well, my favorite book ever is, I think it's called Stoner. And it's, let me just find the author of this book. It's John Williams. Yeah. So this is a fantastic book. Someone recommended it to me. Actually, the same person who recommended Clay to me also recommended this book to me. So she is like on it. It is one of the only books that I've like truly sort of like cried uncontrollably, quite honestly, while
Wow.
reading. And I think about it probably like once a week. It's about this sort of literature professor in the small town that somewhat like life happens to him, and it's a little unclear if it's his fault and he could be more proactive, or if that's just life. But he sort of has a series of unfortunate things happen to him. But he also has moments of happiness over the course of his life, and he somewhat like withdraws into himself towards the end of his life. And it's a sad but moving and like really fantastic book. And so yeah, I read it almost all in one night, as I recall, maybe over 2 nights. And I remember I was just like crying in bed. My wife woke up at like 4 in the morning. I was like, what is going on? But it really like touched me deeply. And yeah, so Stoner by John Williams, fantastic.
I love that. Well, I will read it and report back. And Everett, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate your time. I appreciate all that you and the Clay community are putting out there to help people like me who are trying to grow their companies, because it really works. And I'm sure I'll see you on the conference circuit or somewhere this summer.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Kevin. This was great and fantastic set of questions as well. So appreciate the thoughtfulness you put into this.